And welcome back to our watch party, Northwestern, Illinois. I'm Andy Katz here at the Big Ten Network. Pleased to be joined by J.A. Adande, who's the director of sports journalism, associate professor at the Medill School at Northwestern, his alma mater, class of 92, and a longtime sports journalist at some of the most impressive and popular and important newspapers in this country, as well as a former colleague at ESPN. All right, J.A., first let's go back to what it was like to cover Northwestern basketball as a student journalist.
Well, the year I was on the beat, they went their usual 2-16. That was my sophomore year, the 89-90 season. That was pretty typical. They go 2-16. They throw a scare into some of the big names. So my freshman year, I get there. That was a great year for the Big Ten, right? Michigan and Illinois both go to the Final Four. Michigan wins it all. So having so much talent, having Roy Marble and B.J. Armstrong in the Big Ten, Ohio State had some really good teams. That was a loaded Big Ten. I think that was a freshman. So the year before, 87, Indiana had won the national championship. Michigan wins it all in 89. So the amount of talent that would come through Welsh Ryan Arena in Evanston was astounding. And Northwestern would always hang in there right until the end. And then the talented teams would prevail and pull away down the stretch.
So I had similar experiences because I went to Wisconsin. I'm 1 or 2 years older than you. And I was actually there in 87 when Indiana won. That was my freshman year at Wisconsin. And, I remember that because Wisconsin was not very good. And it was the opposing teams coming through, Bob Knight, obviously, and Lou Henson, Gene Cady, Judd Heathcote. There were these iconic coaches that would come through that I thought were great for me as a young journalist to sort of learn how to deal with, as a student newspaper journalist. What was it like for you when you would deal with these later Hall of Fame coaches that would be coming through?
Yeah, well, that was part of my selling point when I got my first full-time job at the Chicago Sun-Times. Was I said, look, I've been covering these coaches and I've been to all these campuses and I'm familiar with the Big Ten. And so it was a job covering Big Ten football and basketball, primarily the University of Illinois, actually, the opponent for tonight. But that was my job, but that was my selling point because I was really young, but I'd had experience around these guys and they were some big, huge figures on the college basketball landscape. And I remember sitting at a table with Bob Knight at the way they used to do the Big Ten media days. They used to do it at the hotels out by O'Hare Airport. And you'd go there and they'd have a big, conference at the beginning. And then they'd all break up and they'd go sit at individual tables. And you can go around and sit at all the tables. And I remember going right to Bob Knight's table and sitting down next to him. And me and one of my colleagues, Victor Chief from the Daily Northwestern, were firing away, asking our questions of Bob Knight. And it's pretty scary sitting there when you're a young college student trying to talk to Bob Knight. But it like you said, it's a great learning experience because after you've been through that, I'll tell you who's going to scare you after you've been through Bob Knight. John Thompson, because I covered John Thompson with Georgetown when I was at the Washington Post. And let me tell you, even though I'd been, prepped and braced with covering Bob Knight, John Thompson's still going to scare you when you're covering him, let me tell you.
Hey, so I'm actually glad you brought him up. A lot of coaches are wearing the John Thompson Jr. towel as a tribute to the late, great Georgetown head coach, the Hall of Famer. What are your memories of him and his impact, not just on the game, but for young Black student athletes, basketball players, students, potential NBA players, obviously? What was his impact through your prism from what you saw?
He was a beacon and he was an example and he was an instructor. You learned by covering him, right? And just by being around him and being able to absorb his words. And I incorporated a lot of what he had to say, a lot of his perspective. One of his things is funny. I remember him talking before a game in Philly at the 76ers game. So of course, even though I moved on from the Georgetown beat and I was covering the NBA, you don't move on from John Thompson. Because in the spring, in the playoffs every year, he would go around and be there courtside for all of his graduates who were competing in the NBA playoffs, most notably Patrick Ewing and Alonzo Mourning. And, sometimes, a lot of times they wound up playing each other in the playoffs, some of those great Knicks Heat rivalry games. So you just spend a lot of time, and I go up and talk to him before the game. So I was still around him. I was still learning, even after I was no longer covering Georgetown. One of the things he talked about was how we wouldn't be talking about any of these guys if they didn't have big egos, right? Ego is a part of this. Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, John Thompson, all these guys have big egos. But one of the more important racial dynamics that he talked about was the right to fail. And that, Black coaches, and that's what he's talking about at the moment, Black coaches shouldn't have to be perfect. Shouldn't have to be exceptional. They shouldn't have to be John Thompson, the first Black coach to win a national championship in the NCAA tournament. That shouldn't be the standard in order to get hired, right? They should have the right to fail, as he liked to call it. So maybe you have a losing record in your first shot, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get another shot. We'd see white coaches fail and get other opportunities, and we wouldn't see Black coaches fail and get another opportunity. John Thompson would have had another opportunity after Georgetown because of his success there. But in his mind, he should have another opportunity if he had demonstrated something at all. Even if the record didn't reflect it, even if he didn't have a national championship banner, he should have another opportunity if he failed, because that's equality. Because we've seen white coaches get other opportunities after failing. Why can't Black coaches have that same opportunity?
Hey, one thing that's changed since both of us were in college in this conference and nationally is certainly what has happened over the last year is that players have felt empowered to speak out and they've not been stopped. I mean, they've been embraced by their universities, by their college coaches. What have you thought from your vantage point as a professor, as you watch during this pandemic, a lot of these athletes at the collegiate level feeling comfortable through social media, speaking on racism, speaking on injustice, and COVID and everything else that is going on?
I think it's great that they found their voice and that they have the opportunity, and in part it's because of the dismantling of the old structure, right, Andy, when it was just me and you, and they might have to go through, or we would have to go through the sports information director, and they're able to speak to them and able to quote them, then there was a filter in place. But now that they can speak directly and they can say what's on their mind and they can speak their truths, we're seeing the impact. I'm thinking particularly, for example, with Iowa, with the fact that they were able to speak up about the racially charged statements from the coach, the way that they felt offended and belittled by the strength and conditioning coach Chris Doyle there, and ultimately were able to lead to his dismissal and have such a lasting impact that when he was hired to be the strength and conditioning coach for the Jacksonville Jaguars, there was such an uproar that they had to move on from him as well. So that all came from the Iowa football players speaking out. And we've seen several other examples of that, but that's really one of the more notable ones.
All right, I'm going to take a sharp left turn here to back to your days covering Illinois, your first job, you were saying, with the Sun-Times. First of all, for those that don't grasp the drive from Chicago to Champaign, emphasis on the word pain, what's that drive like?
Flat. Not a lot of topography on the landscape, and which was difficult for me coming from Los Angeles, and you're used to the mountains and the ocean. Basically, you cross a river like around Kankakee, I think, on the way down there. It was usually about a 2 to 2.5 hour drive. I think I made it in a Saturday one time in like 1:57. So yeah, that drive was difficult. And I used to, after covering the basketball games, you'd be there late. Like football game, you could go down in the morning, come back up. Basketball game, you're getting there, it's getting late, so you'd stay over. It was the Budgetel back then. It's called like the Americana or the Great America, it changed the names. But back then it was the Budgetel. Wasn't a very high budget that we had, but it's funny because I would tell myself, a kid from Santa Monica, California, like, what am I doing in the middle of the Midwest? What am I doing in Illinois? But some great opportunities. And again, it was a great Big Ten. Just to bring it to another famous coach. So I was covering Illinois that year. Deion Thomas was on that squad, Andy Kaufman, right? So the Illini fans will remember those names. And so they made the NCAA tournament, and we went out in the first round to Salt Lake City. And that was my first time encountering John Chaney. And when he passed away recently, I went through and I found my pictures from that trip. And there was a great picture of him after he talked, he had his little press conference at the hotel on the off day, and he just kind of came out and was just having an informal chat with some of the reporters. And I was up on a balcony overlooking it, and I took a picture looking down of John Chaney surrounded by some reporters. But I'll never forget that press conference, what he said in there. One of the messages that you can never end stupidity, ever. You know, if you see someone who's stupid and crazy, go the other way, because you're not going to talk them out of it. He had a lot of other wonderful, memorable things to say. I just actually dug up my transcript from that press conference after he passed away. But, you know, again, early on in my career, I was able to be exposed to not only the great coaches of the Big Ten, but guys like John Taney and John Thompson, who made a big impression on me.
By the way, that quote should be everywhere with everything we've experienced the last couple of months. All right, last two things, Jay. First of all, the Orange Crush, when it is rocking, when you were covering Illinois, what was that like?
It was fun. You know, the Assembly Hall was a great environment, and the football team was doing really well. They made the Holiday Bowl that year, my first year covering that, which was 1992. So it was a really good year to be covering Illinois athletics. They were on the upswing, or maybe they hadn't even dropped down, you could say. And yeah, Assembly Hall was a great environment, and I kind of miss those days of you know, just a great collegiate basketball atmosphere.
All right, 2017, first time ever. What is the memory that you will keep with you from Northwestern's first ever run to the NCAA tournament?
That moment of delirium. You know, Vanderbilt had a last-second desperation shot and it fell short, and just that delirium. I was jumping around with a couple of my buddies, like one of my freshman roommate and my good friend down the hall from her freshman year, and his older brother. And Rachel Nichols, who was a freshman my senior year, she came up there for that game, and we were all together. And there was a picture of us together. It's kind of fuzzy because the camera's shaking. We're so excited, but just the pure, just moment of like ecstasy. It was like ecstatic. Like, not only did we see our team in the tournament finally, but they won. And I'll never forget that feeling of emotion. And, you know, we see it all the time in March Madness, but finally we at Northwestern got a chance to experience it.
Yeah, it was easy to be a fan, certainly, of that team, and the transition from being a journalist, you're an alum, now you're working there, and certainly it's no problem, you know, segueing to that. Jay, appreciate it. Stay safe and continuing to do great things at Northwestern.
Appreciate it, Andy. Great to see you, and congrats on everything that you're doing, and good luck with everything at Big Ten Network.